happy to introduce Professor Ory Amitay. His lecture on Agatrachides of Cnidos on late 4th century Judean diplomacy.
Okay. Thank you. As an act of captatio benevolentiae, I have to begin with a confession or an apology, and that is that I've been doing this for 20 years or so, speaking in front of academic fora. I've never been so uncertain of what I'm about to say today as I am today. So please bear with me, and I would love to hear what people think, because I need some help. Okay. I chose to tackle a particularly strange question, and that is, how did the prohibition against fighting on the Sabbath come about? We know, I've been over the literature, of course, and I've noticed that two episodes really dominate the discussion. One comes from First Maccabees. We're in the middle of the persecutions of Antiochus, and there's a group of Judeans who they just want to live peacefully. That's what we hear. And they flee to the desert, and they're being hunted down there and attacked specifically on the Sabbath because their attackers know that they would not defend themselves. And they don't. And they die. And when Matityahu, the father of the Maccabees, when he hears about that, he says, any man who should wage war against us on the Sabbath, we shall fight against him, and we shall not all die, as our brothers died in their hiding places. Or at least this is how First Maccabees put it. I have no idea what Matityahu said at the time, but this is the speech that we get. So that's one incident, and it's pretty clear why it captured the imagination, because it's such a horrible story, pathetic. The second story is even weirder. And that is the siege of Jerusalem by Pompey the Great, 63 BCE. We have a relatively very detailed story from Josephus. And he says, okay, the city had already surrendered, and the siege was only of the temple. Now, in the temple was a group of diehard adherents of Aristobulus, one of the two Hasmonean brothers, fighting it out and both appealing to Pompey, and Pompey decides to help Hyrcanos eventually. So Aristobulus is not even there, but his followers are, and they continue to resist, but they do not fight on the Sabbath. And Pompey, I'm sure, gets word of that from Hyrcanos and all the other Judean priests, magnates, and maybe even soldiers on his side, and they tell him, just don't attack. On Saturday, just build the siege engines, right? Work on the siege engines. Don't attack. And this is what he does, and eventually the temple falls. Now, Josephus says, that otherwise the toil would be endless, which is a silly exaggeration, but it's a weird situation nonetheless. I mean, why would people behave like that? This is surely detrimental. And it's not just Josephus. Josephus says, don't believe me, right? You can read Strabo, you can read Livy, you can read Nicolaus. They all speak about it. Nicolaus and Livy are gone on this point, but we actually have a part in Strabo's geography when he talks about it. I'm not going, there are problems with that, but I'm not going into it. Dio Cassius, later than Josephus, repeats Josephus's claims basically, and even puts an emphasis on the critical role of the Sabbath. Okay, so this made a big impression. And I've been asking myself for years, what are the origins of that weird custom? Why would people behave like that, right? The immediate comparandum that comes to mind, that even came to mind a few minutes ago, is the Dorian Carnea. We hear about the Spartans coming late to Marathon. We hear about them not being able to send enough troops to help Leonidas on time. During the Peloponnesian War, they are too slow to help the city of Epidauros, just when the Argives start start the war, right? The Argavs start the war late, the Peloponnesian War. But in all these cases, it's either an excuse. I mean, it was pretty convenient not to show up on Marathon, right? I mean, they didn't know that the Athenians would win. It could have been a disaster. And Leonidas, we had the whole prophecy thing, and I mean, not going out of your way to help Epidauros on a very local thing when you're very afraid to reignite the war with Athens. That makes very good sense to me. And if I look at it from the other way, I mean, we've read the Peloponnesian War. I don't remember it being a part of the Athenian strategy, that there are a couple of weeks out there every year in a very good like fighting season where you could get things done. It's not part of the story. If I were an Athenian, if the Spartans were so into it that this would compromise their security, maybe we would have heard something about it. So I'm putting aside the whole Carnea issue, and I'm turning to another question, and that is, what is even the custom? What was going on here? And there are two opinions in scholarship. One says that there was a total prohibition against any warlike activity on the Sabbath. Nothing at all. The second one says, well, you know, you couldn't attack this. I mean, the first option goes looks back to what happens to these poor martyrs in the desert, right? They wouldn't do anything to defend themselves. The second option says, well, you can't go out on war on Sabbath. You can't be proactive or even active, but you can defend yourself. Self-defense is fine. Okay, and this looks back to the Pompey story. And I think in the last generation and a half, scholarship is leaning towards the second option, right? That defense was allowed. But I'm asking here, what is the difference really? Okay, if we say that we are not allowed to fight on Sabbath at all, that means that we have to be really nice to people because we are extremely vulnerable. This amounts to, in my eyes, complete pacifism. You cannot afford to get into an armed conflict as a group of people, right? Not as an individual, as a city and a kind of province or whatever around it. So you have to be really, really peace-like. But even if defense is allowed, if defensive war is allowed, so okay, if the city is attacked or a settlement is attacked, you can defend yourself, fine. You can retaliate, right? If people attacked you on the Sabbath, you can wait, bite your tongue until Motzei Shabbat, right? And then march right out and beat the living hell out of them, okay? And you have a whole week to do that. You can do skirmishes. What you cannot do is go out on imperialistic escapades. You cannot go on an outgoing war if you cannot fight on the Sabbath. It won't work. Everybody will know about it immediately, and you don't stand a chance. So even if we go with this interpretation, we still get not complete pacifism, but I don't know, a quasi-pacifistic opinion, or at least very non-imperialistic. And again, you have to be really peaceful. If you adopt this piece of halakha, this piece of religious law as way of life, that dictates a whole lot of other things related to diplomacy and war. This is a major thing. When? How? Why? Think about kashrut. Think about purity laws. Think about dressing your body and hair. Think about even Shabbat observances, right? Like, do we bless the wine or the bread first? Okay. Do we have, what are we allowed or what are we not allowed to do at our home? All these things can come from below, and they very often do, sorry. If I see my daughter and I say that she's not modest enough, I can tell her, go put some more clothes on, cover your hair, do something else, right? This is something that happens in the home, in the family, in the community. It happens from below. But not fighting on the Sabbath, I don't see how that can be a grassroots move. That, I think, must come from above, envisioning a very dangerous situation and taking responsibility for whatever happens. So if this comes from above, this must have happened at a particular moment and for a particular reason. So that is one point. Now, the first place to look for it, of course, I mean, why? And even before the why, I mean, where and when. The first place to look is, of course, the Bible. And there is nothing about it in the Bible. A very large body of evidence. I'm aware that I'm arguing from silence here, and I hate to do that, but it's a pretty big silence, okay? Because first of all, there are many wars in the Bible being fought out all the time. We don't hear anything about that anywhere, including long sieges, by the way. Nothing about the Sabbath in that respect. Joshua circled Jericho for 7 days. One of them must have been a Sabbath. When Nehemiah rebuilds the wall of Jerusalem, his guards are there 24/7 for upwards of 7 weeks. There were a number of Sabbaths during that period when they were carrying arms. Okay. Are there specific prohibitions in the Bible except for, don't work? Well, there are. According to Exodus, you cannot collect manna, cook, bake, or light a fire on the Sabbath. According to Numbers, you cannot collect wood. If you try to sell grain on the Sabbath, you will get into trouble with the prophet Amos. Jeremiah says that you cannot move carryables through gates or home doorways, and especially merchandise, but anything at all, really. And when we come to Nehemiah, you can't sell, you can't buy, you cannot tread a winepress, bring in sheaves from the field, load asses with anything. There is a list of the things you cannot load asses with on a Sabbath. And of course, you're not allowed to convey or sell fish, which is one of my favorite psukim in the Bible, because it's the first reference that I know of to the fact that Jews like to eat fish on Friday night, right, on the Sabbath. Earliest mention that I know. So you can't do that either. That's a pretty long list of things that you cannot do on the Sabbath. Fighting is not mentioned. Now, Nehemiah comes very late in the Bible, right? If we look, I mean, I'm putting Daniel aside for the minute because Daniel is some really later parts, but in the biblical story, Nehemiah comes pretty late, and he has Ezra at his side reading a Torah, okay? Nothing in it about that. When the enemies of Nehemiah complain about him to the Persian king, they say, well, he looks like he's preparing to war. He wants to be king here and rebel. Nobody interprets the building of the wall as a kind of a defensive thing that will allow us to keep the Sabbath better. And in the mid-4th century BCE, we even have a rebellion against Artaxerxes III that ends very badly for Judeans. Some are being exiled to Hyrcania, the others to Babylon. So there was some fighting going on there. So no pacifism. So what are we talking about? And finally, we get to Agatharchides. And oh, I forgot to tell you, but there is, I sent it in the chat, over the chat, the handout is over. So we can just look at the PDF or download it or whatever. And I'm going to read very, very quickly what Josephus says and what he says Agatharchides says. And he, Ptolemy, we move on just a little bit in time to Ptolemy the first Soter. I'll talk about the years in a minute. And he captured also Jerusalem using cunning and deceit for having come up to the city on the Sabbath as if to sacrifice. And as the Judeans were not defending themselves against him, for they suspected nothing hostile. And as they happened to be in rest and relaxation, which is my positive translation here, because of the lack of suspicion and the day. The lack of suspicion and the day. He became master of the city without toil and ruled it harshly. And as a witness to this story is Agatharchides of Knidos, who wrote the deeds of the successors, reproaching us for superstition. They say, Daimonia, since because of it we lost our freedom, saying so. There is a people called of the Jews, of the Judaioi, who having a strong and big city, Jerusalem, despised it when it was besieged by Ptolemy, unwilling to take up arms, but through an ill-timed superstition, they submitted to a harsh despot. can read it again also in Greek if you want. I follow, for the time being, I think I'm going to follow Bar Kokhba 2010, who recognizes this as a fragment from Agatharchidis' work on Asia. Section 6 is supposed to be a direct quote. It's extremely laconic. It doesn't even say Sabbath. To me, it sounds like an introduction or an abstract, right? Because if I imagine, it's not, it's not here, it's not behind me. If I look at these 2.5 lines on my page in front of me, and if that was the whole story, then I'm not getting it, right? If this is everything that Agatharchidis told at this point, then I doubt anyone would understand what he was talking about. But if so, how much of what Josephus had just told us comes from what Agatharchidis may have told us? I don't know. I'm going to leave that open for a while, but I just want to turn your attention again to the lack of suspicion and the day. The second fragment is, ooh, who did that? Yay! Great, thank you. The second fragment comes from another work of Josephus, the Contra Apionem, and what he cites Agatharchidis, and what Agatharchidis was talking about is a completely irrelevant and unrelated story about Hellenistic royal politics, maybe in the year 235 BCE or thereabouts. There are some arguments about that. Stratonike, who is the queen of the consort of Demetrius II of Macedon. She gets really upset. She gets upset because he starts to hang around with another woman, maybe wants to marry her. And as a response, she decides to quit on him, sail to the Seleucid realm, and try to get Seleucus II to marry her. Okay, that is her plan. Instead of cooperating, he decides not to marry her and rather to go on a military expedition to the east. He's setting out from Babylon, and while he's on his way, she says, fine, you don't want to marry me, I'm going to rebel, and I don't know exactly what because we lack detail here, but she had a plan. And when Seleucus hears about that, he marches back. The rebellion is quashed, I guess, pretty quickly. She flees from Antioch to Seleucia, to the port, the harbor, and then instead of setting sail and getting out of there, she has a dream that tells her to stay. And the next day they catch her and they kill her. Silly woman, says Agatharchidis. And you know who else is silly? The Jews. They're also silly. And just take a look at this. Those called Judaioi, it's Contra Apionem 208. It's if you can scroll it down a little bit. 209. Those called Judaioi, inhabiting the city strongest of all, which the locals happen to call Jerusalem, being in the habit of being idle on the 7th day, so as not to carry arms in these days, nor to engage in agriculture, nor to perform any other public duty, but rather to pray in the temples, stretching their hands out until the evening. So these people, when Ptolemy, son of Lagos, entered the city with the army, and since the people, instead of guarding the city, persisted with the folly, the fatherland gained a mean despot, and the nomos was convicted as containing an inefficient custom. Okay, I'm not very, I'm not very sure on the translation, so, but I offer some possibilities in some places. Again, going back to Bar Kokhba's work, he says that these fragments come from a different work on Europe, which reached a later period, hence the later 3rd century. And if we look at the text, it says absolutely nothing about the false pretense of pretending to come and sacrifice. It does make a very, much more detailed and very direct reference to the Sabbath. Now, what am I taking from this? 6 minutes I have. Okay, what am I taking from this? First of all, when Ptolemy I captures Jerusalem, according to this story, the Sabbath prohibition on fighting is already in place. It's a given in the story, right? So if we had Nehemiah, and I'm not going to even get remotely close to the argument about the dates of Nehemiah, right? This way madness lies. But we're talking about 100 years, I guess, and in that period, presto, we already have it. It's there. Somebody made it. Okay. And what does it mean? I put an emphasis on that before. What does it mean, lack of suspicion and the day? These are Josephus's words. First of all, did he bring this for the story of false pretense from Agatharchides or not? I'll get back to this in a second. In Contra Pionim, we have Sabbath. We don't have false pretense. Bar Kokhba claimed that we should look here for what he called an unknown internal source. There are certainly plenty of those going around in Josephus's Antiquities. I'm also wondering whether that is, I'm going just a little bit further beyond what he said. I'm wondering whether this may be oral knowledge. Maybe Josephus just grew up knowing this kind of thing. Judean society had a very strong oral component. We see that in all of rabbinic literature. So, okay, consider that as well. But this combination of reasons defies reason in my mind. If this happened on the Sabbath, if there was a full prohibition, why is there even a need for the whole false pretense, right? If he knows that on the Sabbath, Ptolemy, right? If he knows on the Sabbath, he would not be opposed. He doesn't have to pretend. He can just waltz right in. On the other hand, if the false pretense is the issue, why does it have to be on the Sabbath, right? Try to look at it from the perspective of the security people responsible for security, the Kabinet Bitchoni Medini of Jerusalem, right? They can either trust the guy or distrust the guy. Okay, this is the big decision. If they let him in, this is a done deal, right? We're talking about Ptolemy here. This is a guy who fought with Alexander all the way through. If you're letting him into your city with an army, what kind of an edge does the Sabbath give him, right? There is a bit in Tosefta Eruvin. There was an incident at some point where people left all their weapons next to some wall in some room, and then when they all rushed in to take them, they trampled over each other, and some people were killed and injured. Some people have tried to see this as referring to the case at hand, but seriously, you let the guy in with an army, case closed, end of story. So why does it have to be Sabbath? And especially, why did the Sabbath make such a huge impression on Agatharchides if it was really a very small part of the story? It just doesn't add up. Things didn't add up. And now I come to the only way in which they start to add up for me. And strikes me the kind of a lunatic idea, but I'll see what you guys have to say. What I want to suggest is that the prohibition to fight on the Sabbath was invented at that time as a kind of military political theater whose aim was exactly to navigate the situation of the wars of the successors when every 5 minutes you had somebody else ruling you. Now, once you pledge allegiance to somebody, right, and then that somebody goes away and somebody else comes in, the first guy expects you to fight for them. And if you don't, and if they ever come back, you're going to have to pay for that. You're going to have to answer for that. So here's a pretty interesting answer. You know, we really wanted to fight, but he came on a Sabbath. Damn him. Now, yeah, I don't know how convincing you will find that, but in any case, I'm going to use up my minute and a half just to put us in the historical context. There are 3 Levantine campaigns of Ptolemy I. One is in 320, just after he gets rid of Perdiccas very auspiciously. That's probably not it, because all the land operations were handled by one of his lieutenants called Nicanor, and the story seems to call for him in situ. So probably that's not it. It's not conclusive, but probably not it. In 311, we have the Battle of Gaza. Battle of Gaza. These have been going on forever, battles of Gaza. Ptolemy gains the Levant, and then a year later he decides not to confront, he beats Demetrius, he decides not to confront Antigonus and retreat back to Egypt. What he does in the meantime was completely raze Akko, Jaffa, Gaza, and Samaria. Diodorus tells us that. he did not touch Jerusalem. And this is where I got suspicious. Maybe this was part of a kind of deal that let him take Jerusalem, that kept him on good terms with the inhabitants, but also gave the Judeans something that they would trade back, or that they could lean back on if he retreated, right? My time is really up, and if this is accepted, then all kinds of questions and ramifications open up, and I don't have time for them here. We have 5 minutes, so maybe if you ask me questions about that, I will only conclude that, again, if this lunatic suggestion is accepted, what happened next was that after the Ptolemy I, takes over the southern Levant, finally in 302, 301, everybody else, every other successor worth his salt is fighting it out at Ipsos, and Ptolemy takes his time to conquer the southern Levant. Very shrewd fellow. So, but after this, we have about 80 years with no recorded war in the southern Levant, in Eretz Israel. 80 years with no recorded war here, okay? And what I would suggest is that what began as a diplomatic trick became ingrained in society to such a degree in these long years of no conflict, that it became halakha, that people took it to heart. And by the time we reach the Antiochian persecution, this is both an irony and a tragedy. Thank you.
Questions? I have several questions. I apologize if perhaps I...
Wait, who is monitoring the, do I do that? Okay.
My first question is a remark. You have not an absolute prohibition to fight on Sabbath. Prohibition to fight on Sabbath is not mentioned in the Bible, but perhaps implicitly, because could they fight without loading anything on donkeys, without carrying things?
Mm-hmm.
So
well,
perhaps implicitly is.
Well, implicitly, I mean, take a look at the wars, all the wars in the Bible. Think about David, for example. The claim, and I'm not getting into whether David is a historical character or not. I'm not interested in that, okay? I'm not talking about his dating, and I'm not even talking about the extent of his campaigns. I'm just saying that the book, the Bible itself, tells the story of how he builds an empire. You cannot, the implicit message is that you can do whatever you want on the Sabbath. He would not be able to build this empire under these conditions, okay? And again, sieges and what have you. We hear about the sieges, the siege of Jerusalem, for example. At the very end, nothing about that. So again, I would not say that it is implicitly said. I would say the opposite.
The second question is, perhaps I'm not enough competent, but it is often said that Yehuda Maccabi rejected the absolute prohibition to fight on Sabbath. Yes, and it was 100 years before Aristobulus. So, in any way,
okay. This is the thing, okay, and this is why even Josephus, I skipped that. I want to save time, but now it's a good opportunity. Where did it? No, it's not there. It's not there. It's let me see. Okay, Josephus, when he says, you know, if you don't believe me, go read Strabo, go read Nicolaus, go read Livy, right? That this is not, and that way you will know that this is not merely a story to set forth the praises of a fictitious piety, but the truth. Okay. This is Antiquities 1468. He realizes that people reading that might say, you know, this doesn't make sense. It cannot be true. Okay. The situation itself is mind-boggling. It really is. And what I'm what I'm trying to do is explain, or at least find the beginning of an explanation as to how did it come about, because it's really weird. Question from, is there anything on, okay, we have to switch? Okay, okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
זה רציתי, לזה הגעתי.
Now,